Mucho gusto.
It is my pleasure to moderate this conversation during this afternoon, the first session after our inauguration of the siege to civilization. I would like to welcome Cici Paparazzi, an academician specialized in digital communication, editor of the Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media, holds different papers under her name covering democracy and the digital sphere. Welcome to Mexico. We also have Jose Waldenberg with us, politologist, sociologist, the first chair of the Federal Electoral Institute, who has used his intelligence in a very versatile way to understand the origins of the Mexican left, how our democracy has been built. Jose Waldenberg, thank you very much for joining us. Hector Aguilar Camin. Hector is many things at the same time. A novelist, a very critical analyst, a journalist, a historian, founder of Nexus Magazine, Kali Arena Publishing House. Hector, thank you very much for joining us today. And we have Claudio Lominitz, a Mexican professor, anthropologist, probably the best anthropologist of your generation, always concerned about decency and the origins of very good ideas. Claudio, our pleasure. This conversation is devoted, and the title speaks for itself. We're going to review the elements that have our civilization under siege. I cannot turn a blind eye to Norbert Elias' words. With his very critical mind, used his intellectual time to describe the processes through which civilizations has gone through, and he realized that he had to describe the processes that take civilizations a step backward. Civilizations is a construct that is not continuous, and it shows steps that go back. We don't know yet if we are witnessing a discontinuous moment or we are going back one step. Frankly, all of us sitting on the panel, we grew intellectually with the idea in mind that there were cultural acquisitions, achievements, values that were here to stay. It is very hard to assume that globalization could be under threat or that commercial protectionism could come back. It was difficult to assume that multilateralism would be under siege with new bilateralistic approaches, or it was very hard to assume that immigration would turn to be such a hardship as we see today, and authoritarian pulses would win over democracy. It is very difficult to describe our times. To call it postmodern is not enough. And that is why we are gathered here today to attempt to discuss about these threats posed to our civilizations and describe our times, each one from your own stand. I'm going to give the floor to Cici. You have the floor. You have 15 minutes, and then each one of the speakers will have the same time, 15 minutes to present your words, and we're going to have 1 hour of conversation. The second hour of this event is going to be used to discuss what our speakers had shared, and of course, we're going to take questions from you. You're going to be given blank cards. Of course, we're going to get questions over different media. And I will be moderating as well the second hour, and I'll be receiving your questions. So please, Sissy, without further ado, it is your turn.
Good afternoon. I'm just going to wait a minute for my slide to come down.
Cuidado.
There we are. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to visit and share my research and my thoughts with you, to be part of this conversation at such an important point in time, and of course to be in such good company. I look forward to the second part in our conversation with all of you. Most of my work focuses on the social and political consequences of the net and the platforms that it supports. Lately, I've become interested in structures of feeling, soft structures of feeling, or sentiment and civic engagement. So this is what I would like to talk about today, through focusing on some work we have been conducting on structures of feeling online. So with my colleagues at the University of Illinois in Chicago, we've been tracking sentiment expression online, following prominent hashtags, starting with the revolution in Egypt in 2011 and the events that led to the resignation of Hosni Mubarak, then tracking following several movements of the so-called Arab Spring, then moving on to the Occupy movement, tracking the growth of the Tea Party movement, the neoconservative movement in the United States, how those morphed into the alternative right, and now the alt-right movement, tracking those. Also, of course, tracking Black Lives Matter, DACA and immigration issues, and of course, lately, MAGA. So there's not enough time to talk about all of this today. So for my intervention, I will focus first on sharing some thoughts on the impact of internet for democracy. And then I will talk about some of our research to illustrate the sort of transgressions, democratic transgressions that the internet and social media enable, facilitate. So let me start with this. I've been studying the internet for over 20 years, since the mid-90s. I started studying it when it was a very small and strange medium, and we weren't really sure who was using it. Less than 5% of the US population used it or had access to it. Less than 1% globally used it. And the question that I love returning to is this: does the internet democratize? And the answer that I always arrive to in my own work, but also through consulting the work of others, is summarized here. So the internet is not a magical space. It cannot create something out of nothing. If democracy does not exist, the internet on its own will not make it manifest. The second point I want to make is the internet will pluralize, but it will not democratize. As we say in my native Greek, it's a demotic medium, it is not a democratizing medium. It opens up many avenues for connection and for expression. Not all of these avenues turn into pathways for democracy. It connects democratically oriented people, but it also connects fascists. And finally, the internet amplifies. Okay? It amplifies voice. It amplifies visibility for underrepresented publics, for marginalized issues, but it doesn't equalize. It doesn't guarantee that all these people will get equal time or equal access to power. And also, the internet does not create or extinguish social phenomena. So, for example, the internet does not create hate speech. Hate speech has existed for a very long time. But what the internet does, unfortunately, is it makes hate speech more visible. and it allows it to spread more quickly. Yet, at the same time, for movements that are focused on issues of social justice, like Black Lives Matter, the internet will also allow those movements to become more visible, to have a voice that can be heard more loudly. And it will allow those movements to connect people more quickly and more effectively. So in the words of Melvin Kranzberg, the internet or technology is neither positive nor negative, nor is it neutral. So let me talk a little bit about what we do. We use affect theory, which is a complex theory with roots in political science, psychology, and philosophy. It's very complex to explain. I will very quickly describe it as saying that affect is about the intensity with which we feel. It is not the same thing as emotion. Okay, it's a synonym for sentiment, mood, feeling. It is about the difference between me poking you versus pushing you versus shoving you to the ground. There is a lot of intensity. That is a key word to emphasize in the movements that we study and how those movements manifest themselves online. And this is why we use affect theory to interpret and understand those movements. We also use framing theory, and this is a theory that explains how the media frame our understanding of the world surrounding us, of events that we cannot experience directly. And this theory has its roots in a number of different disciplines, sociology, but also anthropology, communication, political science, media and cultural studies. And lastly, we conduct big data analysis and also deep data analysis. So large social network analysis, but also deep qualitative work to ask, do social media make or break movements, revolutions, elections, democracies? Let me summarize a few key findings just from a few studies that we've done. So starting in 2011, when we first became involved in this line of research, the first movement we looked at was Egypt, and we focused on the events leading to, during, and immediately after the resignation of Hosni Mubarak. And we tracked the social media presence of those movements, focusing especially on Twitter. What did we find? Well, for Egypt, we found conversations between people who agreed, and those conversations tended to strengthen the shared sense of identity. We also found a heavy volume of retweeting, and that contributed to the intensity of the movement. And we also found that those conversations between people who agreed helped people to collaboratively frame that movement as a revolution well before that movement had actually resulted in regime reversal. And some would argue that ultimately, still today, that movement did not produce complete, comprehensive regime reversal. Now, with the Occupy movement, this is a very different movement with a very different digital footprint. This movement served as an open signifier in Gramscian terms that allowed people to stand up and be counted. Okay, it's a very powerful symbolic message to say, Occupy Wall Street. And in the beginning, we were able to trace conversation between people who agreed. But progressively, people started to disagree. And these disagreements tended to strengthen in and out group affiliations. They underlined ideological differences, especially because these disagreements came in the form of content injections that disrupted the movement, and they also took the form of hashtag hijacking that sought to delegitimize the movement that came from the side of the neoconservatives, also came from the part of the Tea Party. And these forms of hashtag hijacking ended up producing a stop and go, a standstill motion for the movement. Now, with Black Lives Matter, here we're looking at a movement, at a public that's much more sophisticated, much more tech-savvy, better able to use the technology to connect people to further its cause. But again, here what we see is that windows of opportunity for change open up at peak times of the movement. However, unfortunately, during the same times, there's hashtag hijacking in the form of counter tags like White Lives Matter, like All Lives Matter, that takes away from the key point of the movement. And finally, with MAGA, Make America Great Again, we see a lot of intensity, very little movement. People are not really sure where this is headed and hasn't really gotten anywhere thus far. Much discord and many bots, okay? A lot of content that is bot propagated, and this is a stark difference between the very first study that we did with Egypt, where we could say with a fair amount of certainty that there was minimal bot presence, to MAGA, where the majority of the content that we examine has to be checked to determine whether it's fueled by bot intelligence. What does all this mean? I'll start with a more timely question. Do social media make or break elections? No, they don't. Okay, the media do not tell us what to do. We are not automatons. But here's what media and social media do. They tell us what to think about, so they populate our infoscape with news stories, and they present some of those news stories as being very important. And then they also tell us how to think about issues. They give us terms with which we think about those issues. They give us language that we use when we describe, when we think, when we have conversations about those issues. Now, the second question. Do social media make or break revolution? Because revolution leads to change, and we want to talk about that. They don't, but they intensify movements, often leading to populism. Populism is nothing without intensity. You know, you take intensity away, and populism is like a balloon that has deflated. Social media connect, but they also divide. And finally, most importantly, they enable acts of symbolic impact. And this is something that I want to talk about. The connections, the expressions that these media facilitate are not going to lead to impact that is instant, or legislative, or political, or sociocultural, or economic. Their impact is symbolic. The agency that they afford is semantic. They allow us to discursively renegotiate how key terms are used. And the power that they afford is liminal. It's ephemeral. It's evanescent. But to say that something has symbolic impact is no small thing, and I'll explain why. All too often, we are swayed by the speed with which information moves online, by the virality of information. And we think that change is going to follow at an equally speedy manner. And when change doesn't follow, we become disillusioned in our media, in our politicians. But it's not just our media or our politicians who are to blame here. It is our own expectations that have misled us. Because change is gradual. and revolutions are long, and they have to be long in order to attain meaning. So to say that something carries symbolic impact, to be able to say Black Lives Matter, to point to a certain kind of social injustice, is no small thing. In order to change our institutions, we have to reimagine them first. And so I will leave you with this final thought. Technologies network us, yes, but it is our stories that connect us, identify us, and also potentially divide us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. 15 minutos exactos. Muchísimas gracias.
15 minutes sharp. Now I would like to give the floor to Jose Wildenberg. Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to thank the National Autonomous University and the University of Guadalajara for this invitation. And it is my pleasure to share this roundtable, but there is no roundtable here. But I'll read from my notes then. 1. 12 years ago, the United Nations Program for Development, in a very optimistic attitude due to the newly created institutions in Latin America, made an alert of the possibility that the discomfort that democracy was undergoing would become a discomforting democracy. I don't know if that transition has consolidated yet, but there are many elements to consider that such possibility is becoming a reality. It is a phenomenon, as the classical would say, unequal but combined. It is a global discomfort that is heated by an anti-political discourse that finds very powerful nutrients to expand and deep root between different groups of citizens that are very large. This discomfort can be measured. The latest report, the Latino Barometer for this year, says, and I quote, "The decline of democracy overall in the region." They describe it, the democratic diabetes, an invisible condition that is not causing any alarm, but it eats up our own lives gradually. In our case, Mexico, the support to democracy went down 10 percentage points between 2016 to 2017, from 48 to 38%, being the country in Latin America in which we see the deepest drop. And along these figures, we are witnessing the emergence of rhetoric that it's becoming hegemonic between politicians, mainstream media, the academia, and commentators. We have used a rhetoric that it's now common sense that discredits blocks of political parties, governments, not one single politician or one single political parties, politicians and political parties as if they were one thing, not a representative or a parliamentary group. No, all lawmakers just because they are lawmakers. Not government A or government B. We discredit all of them equally. Here, the tiny little problem, air quotes, there is no possible democracy without those stakeholders, and what we have set into motion has gained its own life. Commentators as well as comedians that they end up their own routines, and tweeters that they speak the awful truth. They use a well-tested recourse to discredit politicians as a bloc, a world inhabited by dumps, illiterates, and thieves. Of course, I'm not saying that there are not some of them, but we have spread the word of certain kind of rhetoric and ideas that we won't be able to put a stop to, and construct an anti-political rhetoric that it's affecting democracy. We have set a mechanism into motion that deploys with its own inertia, and it's growing in force, and it's very likely that we cannot put a stop to it. If we want to put a stop to it, the expansion of anti-political rhetoric that very fast steps into an anti-democratic ground, it is crucial that we address the causes of discomfort to our societies. And I'm going to mention some words about the anti-immigration reactions that we've seen in different countries, just to put an example of how much disgust and would could be exploited in different ways. And then I will define what, in my opinion, are the most important nutrients of this discomfort in Mexico. I believe that we are bound to fight the causes of discomfort and the sources of anti-political discourse. Discomfort is based in different factors, and that is linked to an economy in crisis or an economy that doesn't grow fast, and that economy cannot create a horizon of productivity for millions of young people who are looking for a job. If we analyze the case of Greece and Spain just as two examples, my point is clear. After their own democratic transitions, after becoming part of the EU, after economically expanding, the political and social life seemed to be sailing smoothly. But when the crisis came, discomfort felt against the institutions that make democracy possible. Those institutions were quietly affected, and it cannot happen other way. Societies cannot stand still when their jobs are gone, when their health systems deteriorate, among many other things. In Greece, such a discomfort was used by a small left-wing organization that, after managing the crisis with an inclement orthodoxical standpoint, they came into power. From my very own point of view, that is the virtuous side of it. Notwithstanding that, and in parallel, we saw how publicly it grew, and we saw in voters a fascist movement that blamed immigration of all the evils in the country, and they became large in number from 0% of the votes to up to 8%. That particularly takes me to say that it's not only this cause of discomfort, but the political orientation that the voters take on. Trump winning, for example, is another example, but we can take our eyes to Poland, France, and Hungary, where supremacist groups have grown in number in late years. Our neighbor in the north, the U.S., since Trump jumped into the political scene, he was very successful in his way into the presidential race. Many, even when he spoke like lower classes, and he conquered the heart of 60 million U.S. citizens. So that is not going to be easy to take it back. Racism, that intellectual spring, air quotes again if you want, that creates a line between we the whites and you the others, starting with the migrants coming from the south, gained sympathies that now they claim the right to speak up. His racism that worked pretty well turned out to be very empathic with many people tired of traditional policy, probably victims of the wild globalization and trained in the anti-political rhetoric. In sum, all of our problems emerge in Washington. We have to highlight that not a single explanation in this arena can become a justification. And what is most critical and reprehensible is that he opened the door and he legitimized racist groups that were there in the American society but were at the sidelines because there was an anti-racist consensus that was present in the political arena, in the media, in universities, in arts, and many other expressions. Trump did not only use dynamite to that consensus, it became the umbrella under which the most extreme expressions of hate, intolerance, and violence are sheltered. In every single society, there are diatribes and political attitudes that need to be taken to the sidelines. Expressions of racial superiority that are the first step to harass minorities that become scapegoats. The good polity does not exist at the same time. It tries to put a stop to all of that and reprehend those. It tries to limit all those, but Trump has done the opposite. Trump has created such a context in which the members of the KKK and Nazi organizations feel encouraged and protected by their president. White supremacists, that to many was an issue of the past, is alive today, and I believe that it is due to the president. Charlottesville episode is a true sign, and it was very revealing of how this groups are belligerent, and the hidden sympathy of Trump for them. Trump cut the ropes that had petrified or semi-petrified these racists. He normalized his existence and gave a naturalization permit to expressions that many of the American citizens thought were an issue of the past. The problem here, as Eunice Rendon describes with the information taken from the United Nations, that there are 244 million immigrants who live in a different country from where they were born. And that represents, in her words, an increase of 63% in the last 2 decades. And we have seen that different countries see that same reality to exploit the worst xenophobic feelings. Immigration will continue because millions of people want to have a better standard of living in the most developed corners in the world. This is a phenomenon that we can't stop. The problem is that every time we see more demagoguery and use migrants as scapegoats. Todorov, who recently died, published a book titled precisely We and the Others. The subject matter of the text is this: the existence relationship between I and my cultural group and the others, all of those who are not part of my cultural group. That is to say, that coexistence between people's diversity and human unity. He said, I'll try to probe into how things have developed, but also how things should develop. Diversity and unity in mankind, that is the subject matter. And having these two together, a tremendous challenge, because these two dimensions have created very problematic rhetorics to say the same thing. The paradox here is that from benevolent premises, we get to perverse statements. For universalists, we are all one, we're all equal, and that highlights the unity of mankind. That is very right to say. But if we don't value the differences that history, geography, and culture create, we might think that ours is what prevails and not what comes from other places. Because if that virtuous premise, we are all equal, we don't have it go through the nuance lens, we can create what I called a blind universalism. All of those who have tried to impose their ways of governing, their values and views. On the other hand, particularists are able to identify diversity. In my opinion, I believe that that is a very good premise. But if we don't assume that there are universal values, that might justify everything as specific actions that explain with cultural specificities. And we can have and result particularisms that are trapped into views that only value what is of their own and despise what comes from others, because they don't want to see or get contagion for what comes from abroad. And Trump is a true representation of what is fair, of my own values that are only valid for me and my own. All what comes from abroad is not valid. That exalting view of what is mine is the foundation of racism that unfortunately expresses and confers legitimacy to different pulses that are deep-rooted in mankind. Todorov, by recognizing equality in humankind, he believed in the unity of all species. And he wrote, and I'll quote him again, mankind are ethnocentric. They all is judged according to their habits. An immediate action would be to make them aware of the existence of others, to teach them about the basics of tolerance, but then we have to go beyond matters and try to reach the universal values of justice. 3 basic steps that should be taught always. 1, naturally, we understand the world through our eyes, always with a certain bias. Number 2, but there are others that we need to understand and value. And 3, however, it is not about making what exists contemporary. We have to judge things in order to change, because not every single behavior is universal and equal. I believe that Mr. Trump and his followers are stuck in step number 2. They're dangerous. They despise and debase others. And who are others? We are those others. Number 3, our own case. Mexico was able to build a germinal democracy. Every signs of democracy are pretty visible. pluralistic congresses, elections, a presidency, and governor's offices with no majority in their own congresses, town halls that have different political representations, and we have extended use of liberties. However, the social discomfort is quite visible as well, and trust in stakeholders and institutions that make democracy possible is very low. Four powerful cataracts feed this discomfort, and I am afraid if we don't address those discomfort in our democracy, will become or is becoming a discomfort about democracy, poverty, inequality, a very fragile social fabric. The historical failure in Mexico is the one of its deep inequality. We're not one country, we're many countries in one, and that affects every sphere in life. As ECLAC for Latin America points out, in such conditions, it is very unlikely to create a very inclusive we, a feeling of belonging to one country. Differences are so deep that generate a certain of coexistence that is stressful and filled with resent. I want to go back to my previous statement. UNDP 13 years ago raised that question. How much poverty, how much inequality the new, renewed Latin American democracies can put up to? What happens is that amongst us, effective policies are not visible in order to fill these inequality gaps and make our social fabric stronger. Our recent democracy doesn't have an impact in this arena, but that cauldron of inequalities, it is creating discomfort. It creates criticism in terms of the new routines, institutions, and standards that process a pluralistic polity. And it is natural because polity, including a democracy, it is not an activity without a context, without strings attached, without expectations that go beyond how democracy develops. Now, economic stagnation and its side effects, the lack of development in the last decades, it is probably the source that we could describe as more powerful. An economy that is not creating jobs, an economy that is not creating better standards of living for most of the population, that creates jobs that the young are not going to be able to fill in a frame of old inequalities, has to create discomfort, helplessness, and either we want it or not, the political regimes are judged about how they fulfill their population's needs. And in the first years of democracy and this transition are equal to economic stagnation. Number three, corruption. Corruption and impunity are eroding the trust that people have in public institutions. I don't know if we have more corruption than we had in the past, but what it is very clear that those phenomena are more visible to the eyes of the public given the democratization process. And here we have two powerful leverages that need to be used in order to fight corruption, because nothing worse more the value to political parties, congresses, and other stakeholders than impunity. And fourth, if we add up the spiral of violence that in the last years has shocked our country, probably this picture can be finished. And I'm going to use figures for kidnaps, killings, and aggressions that have affected social coexistence. Hundreds of thousands have been victims of crime directly, but all of those who have not suffered violence yet live under the shadow of uncertainty and fear. The violence climate and its aftermath create lack of trust and also discredit institutions. Criminal gangs have attacked populations, have trafficked drugs, weapons, and humans. They are in a turf war, and they have extorted thousands of citizens. They have imposed their law in many areas, and that has taken a death toll, an enormous death toll. And the fight that the law enforcers have waged, we're not trained to do that, and they have multiplied the violations to human rights, extrajudicial executions, and disappeared individuals, a spiral that has seeded death, fear, and uncertainty. In sum, democracy is a way of government that strengthens what citizens appreciate the fact that they can use their liberties, vote, change governments, create representational positions, but when they also see that their standard of living improves, they feel members of a we that feel the we that describes what is ours and have some influence in politics. I believe that Mexico has been able to build a germinal democracy, and this is what I've insisted on. And we have to celebrate that fact, but we still need everything else. And I hope we don't feel ashamed of living our democracy under siege and unprotected, and it's being attacked from all flanks. Thank you.
Now, we'll give the floor to Héctor Aguilar Camín. You have the floor, please. Well, let me tell you a few incredible things and other very obvious things. The incredible ones need figures. So get ready for figures. I ask for your patience, of course. Bear with me. Well, this is always a good moment. It's always a good moment to say that everything's going bad. I mean, that things are always going wrong. But people celebrating the kindness of our times, we immediately, after celebrating, we are very ironic about this because we take the invincible Pangloss character who, in the midst of wars and endless disasters, he always believed to be living in the best of the possible worlds, yes. And the novel includes Pangloss. There is the name of his Discipline, Candid. And this is the optimism, this version of the optimism that accompanies the spirit of progress, the belief in progress, believing in progress. Now, the first incredible thing that I wanted to tell you is that progress exists in spite of Voltaire. And material progress is evident. And it proves itself, it shows itself in the quality, productivity, and also the duration of today's life vis-a-vis life expectancy 100, 500, or 1,000 years ago. But moral progress can also be proven. And it is proven through the extraordinary fact, incredible, for the sensation we all have of the world, that humankind, or man, is perhaps the most dangerous animal of the zoological kingdom, is today less bloodshedding, less sanguinary, and less cruel than ever before in the history of humankind. A seminal author of this vision of the man as an enhanceable, perfectible man, a sociologist from Vienna. Vienna is, and now he did all his, Norbert Elias, he did all his career in the UK. As Pangloss, in the midst of world wars and post-wars, Mr. Elias devoted his academic and reflections and work, and his historic works to reading the secrets of what was called the civilizatory process, or the civility or civilizatory process. He showed that slow change of rules of coexistence, of dealing with each other in a society, could dilute little by little the barbarous conduct that seemed to be substantial to human nature. He discovered, for instance, that the mess of murals introduced in the French courts of the 16th, 17th century put an end, little by little, to the everyday use of the knife within homes and palaces, and therefore to the pest of the courtesan banquets that ended in people knifing each other. Well, I recognize this is not the best moment of the global mood, let alone of the Mexican mood or way of feeling things, to talk about these things, but I think it's always a good moment to challenge, to question our beliefs. that are the wrong beliefs, perhaps, that make us have this such bad mood, that they make us feel so bad, especially if there's a way of showing those beliefs are in effect wrong. We do not live, of course, in the best of the possible worlds, as Pangloss wanted us to live in, but it is a fact that we live in the least violent of the known worlds. Never have we had less violence in history than now. Never. Societies had been less barbarous and human beings less bloodshedding. I told you I was going to talk to you about incredible things, and that's what I'm doing. This is one of them. This is perhaps the principal one of them. Well, this is a very amazing and very sound matter of a book, but Steven Pinker, that's called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. It was published in 2012. The title takes a phrase from the first speech when President Lincoln took office in the United States in 1861. With this speech, Lincoln tried to put away the ghost, the phantom of civil war that was over the United States because of the secession of the South states in that part of the world. Well, after clarifying this and saying this in the speech, she's saying we're even ready to go to war to avoid the rupture of this union. Lincoln ended up with his speech with these words, his inaugural speech. These are lyric registry words, but very difficult to translate. We're not enemies, we're friends. We shouldn't be enemies. Although passions are unleashed, they shouldn't be breaking our ties of affection. The mystic notes of our memory coming from each one of the battlefields and from the grave of each one of our patriots, going into each one of the hearts and each one of the homes of this great land, will be part of the choir of this union when they're once more played and touched by the best angels of our nature. End of quote. Well, this speech, after that, it was the most cruel civil war in the part of the world. Of course, Voltaire will perhaps be smiling. Pinker has written this very long, dense book. It's a fascinating book explaining when he's explaining how and why we've had a declining violence since the history of humankind and the Civil War. His findings not only contradict our perception living in the worst of all possible worlds, but it denies this position altogether. From the point of view of violence, the past of humankind, our history is effectively, as he's saying, a foreign country, a country that we do not know or that we ignore. So he says there are 6 historic trends and 5 civil story forces that are responsible for this declining, this diminishment of violence. The historic trends are, first, the pacification process, the peace process that brought with it the historic passing from nomadism, depredatory nomadism, to sedentary agriculture. This is the beginning of the sedentary agriculture that reduced violence so much in the coexistence of human beings. The second civilization process was induced by monopolization of violence by the state, by the different states in history. The third fundamental element of historic trend of this civilizatory process was humanitarian revolution, sowed in the heads and emotions of men and women through the ideals of the Enlightenment. And then the fourth one, the fourth great historic trend, is the long peace, he says, the world has lived since the end of the Second World War. And the fifth element is the trend, and we're going into the topic of the symposium, is the new peace following after the Second World War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the sixth, the trend in our everyday lives, but we don't really understand because of the strength it has, is the era of revolution of rights. That starts in 1948 with the Declaration of Universal Rights of Man, and it opens the era of moral revolution that extends up to our times under the form of the gradual universalization of civil rights, of women's rights, of children's rights, and the rights of lesbian, gay communities, and increasingly the rights of animals. The five great civilizatory trends or forces, according to Mr. Bringet, are sedentary agriculture, the state, trade, commerce, feminization of customs and traditions, cosmopolitanism, and the relationship among peoples, and the advent of reason as an instrument of coexistence among nations and among people. The four protecting angels, he says, the best angels of our nature are empathy, self-control, moral sense, and once more, reason, the rational conduct. The five demons that are anti-civilizatory demons are change, violence, domination, vengeance, revenge, sadism, and ideology. Well, this vision of this author is anything except a recipe book of historic optimism. It is a scientific exploration of sound, solid statistical fundamentals on the diminishment of the reduction of human violence according to the figures that I've just given you. And statistical data shows that humankind has never been less violent than now. Never have less people died in battlefields, or never has war taken so many lives as in the last 50 years. Never the human species has shared civilizatory values that are so high in so many countries and as second nature in so many millions of human beings. Here, let me give you some figures. They're counterintuitive. That's why I ask you to listen to them carefully. The safest place or most secure place that has ever existed in the history of humankind is the Western Europe of today, where the rate of homicides is 1 for every 100,000 inhabitants. The most dangerous zone that has ever existed is the Cato community in California in the 1840s, where the violence rate was 1,500 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants at one point. The forensic exploration of archaeological sites has allowed to measure, because of the lesions and the injuries of the skeletons found, the incredible proportion of human beings that died violently in prehistoric times. An average of 15% of total deaths is influenza, flu, in 524 homicides for each 100,000 inhabitants. And the first arch of reduction of violence was of the predator nomadism and the appearance of agricultural communities. So the state is the great pacifier. And the state was also the origin of the later wars in history, the great wars, and the ones he calls emoclistic wars. But violence the state was able to reduce was higher, a lot higher than what it was created later on. The very governed world of the Aztecs had a rate of 250 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. This is a very high rate. However, half of the average rate of states with no, rather societies with no states. Post-absolutist France of the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, at the end, had an average of 70 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. This is the ratio Venezuela has today. This is a surprisingly low figure compared to those of past centuries. The world wars of the 20th century had rates of violence of 144 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants in Germany, 135 per 100,000 in the USSR, and 27 per 100,000 in Japan. Very close to the Japanese one, very close to the figure we now have on Japan. Well, we Mexicans know something about homicides per every 100,000 inhabitants, and we had 8 homicides per every 100,000 in 2007. We reached 23 per 100,000 in 2011. Then, after a few years of these figures falling, we're going back to those figures, 22 or 23 per every 100,000 inhabitants. That's this year, 2017. Now, Mexicans of today, we can imagine what was like to live under the figures of the Aztec empires, 250 people getting killed for 100,000 inhabitants. The size of the horror between one set of figures and the other set of figures is the size of our civil story process. Since the end of the Second World War, then, the number of people dying in civil wars, ethnic, religious wars, and terrorist actions has just been declining. At the same time that it increases, it orders something like a perpetual peace imagined by Descartes, in which step by step we're seeing the victory of the best impulses of nature, of the moral animal, men, empathy, self-control, the moral sense, and reason. These are the figures. These are the facts of history. But social melancholy that we now live in cannot be dissipated or rebated or refuted with statistics. Human beings are dying in wars, and therefore we have the sensation, the thermal feel of a very violent world in which we live. And the fall of the Berlin Wall ended the Cold War and opened a moment of peace and prosperity, the biggest trophy of which was perhaps the unification of the Western world around the values of democracy, prosperity, free trade, cooperation among nations, globalization, and the end of the phantom of nuclear catastrophe. The construction of the wall by Trump summarizes and represents everything that's the opposite, contrary to everything I've said. The hegemonic power of the Western world and the president whose utopia, regressive utopia, is Make America Great Again, MAGA, is built with the old discourse of racial discrimination, rejection of free trade, and authoritarianism, unilateralism at the diplomatic level, isolationism, strategic isolationism, and nuclear threat that we have seen these days, especially against North Korea. Now, the intensity cannot be over-exaggerated, in which countries of the Western world are opening their paths, and isolationism and nationalist, xenophobic, and racist and anti-Semite trends. This is regressing to the worst of the past. In the face of frustration, that is true, because of the worst features of our present. And this wave explains Brexit and the advent of xenophobism and nationalism and the situation in Europe and Trump taking over the United States. And this is the representation of the oldest part. I'm not talking about the smallest part, but yes, the oldest part, the less open part of the U.S. society, open to the future, of course. And this paradox is of great concern to us. It's disquieting because the most advanced society has chosen the emissar of a regressive utopia who wants to turn the clock to the past and make the U.S. and America great again. And how does he want to do this with anything, whatever? Nuclear risk, for instance, migration, exclusion, racial discrimination, and commercial protectionism, diplomatic bilateralism, isolationism, more than with the responsibility of a great power. Let me go back to Pinker and his explanation of civilization and the comment that Ricardo Rafael made at the beginning of this. If something is lacking in Pinker's vision, is what Ricardo said, is a tragic suspicion proven by history that the best angels of our nature usually defeated unexpectedly by our worst demons. The First World War, you might remember, interrupts one of the longest eras of peace and civilization known until that time by Europe. The civilizatory process of the last 50 years, because of the quality it has, it only runs one risk, just one risk, of suddenly becoming the opposite. And this is the risk of a nuclear confrontation. It has other long-term risks, of course, like climate change. However, an imminent risk of turning completely opposite of what this time of peace is, in spite of the fact of our thermal sensation, that this is one of the most violent times in history. The true risk is nuclear confrontation. This is the risk with which President Trump plays in these days in his tournament of threats against North Korea. If his threats go into effect, if they have an effect, if the dictator of North Korea is convinced that in effect it'll be his country will be erased from the planet, what incentives would he have not to launch his bomb? Well, this situation of President Trump is not only a siege, an attack against civilization, but it is a true risk of destruction of our own civilization. Thank you.
Hector, thank you very much. Now, I would like to give the floor to Claudio Lumlitz. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the university for organizing this panel and, of course, for inviting me. I wrote some notes. This is what I would like to share about the new nationalisms and the new avenues that can take us back to old nationalisms like ours, vis-a-vis the emergence of neo-nationalism in the United States. Before jumping to the subject matter, I would like to describe what ethno-nationalism is. Is it Trumpism, a new nationalism? The answer to this question is not an easy task. On one hand, Trumpism could be seen as a religious nationalism and not necessarily ethnic. To put a halt to the entry of Muslims into the United States, and some months ago, Donald Trump saying that that he wanted to have Christian Syrians in the U.S., but it would be banned having Muslim Syrians into the country. This might indicate some religious background in this patriotic feeling, and that formula, going back to an undefined past, make America great again. So going back to something again suggests the new creation of ethnic and racial hierarchies that dominated back then in those golden years. That is to say, a hierarchy that at the top had the whites, and specifically men, white men. And lastly, that heads-on attack against Mexican migrants questions Mexican, Central American, South American-born immigrants that now live in the United States. All of them are grouped as Mexicans. and that they have to show loyalty to the old values of this nation to make a difference between them and undocumented migrants. So if we use the ethno-nationalistic formula to describe this type of Trumpism, we need to be very cautious when we do it, because this political institution is based on a very complex alliance that it is based, on the one hand, on an ideology of restoring a social hierarchy that used to be racist to protect its own, and building an anti-immigration policy that debases and criticizes the skills and mores of undocumented migrants. So Muslim migrants and Mexicans have been discredited. That is true. But the door is open to debase and denigrate any other group if it's necessary. For example, if you read today's headlines, you can see that it has been decided to deport from the U.S. at 60,000 migrants from Haiti that came during the earthquake that happened 10 years ago. And if they need it, they could insult any other group of immigrants. In this context, investing in a wall on the border with Mexico, it is investing in patrolling the ethnic and racial borders inside the U.S. And what do I mean by this? The border is not a place, it is not a line on a map. The border is how every day different social groups interact. The border is a social interaction. Wherever there are checkpoints, it might be the case of a school in Alabama. When you enroll your children, you have to show that you are not an undocumented migrant. Or it could be a police officer, trooper in Indiana asking for papers. Anywhere you are asked for papers, there is where we see a border being built in such social interactions. And a border is a social interaction that happens informally, discriminating against peoples that look or sound like Mexicans, a category that includes almost all Central American migrants and also migrants from South America. We all know this. We all know this investment, this silly and stupid investment in a wall is very productive in terms of social and racial discrimination domestically. Having said this, is there anything else to be said about the wall and Trump in Mexico? Well, I would like to make a pause and share with you what has just happened with Puerto Rico in the last few months. I believe that this can help us understand this issue. Nationalisms that aim to turn their backs to international agreements and national standards and claiming their own interests as a banner are old school imperialism attitudes and result inevitably in a hard line colonialism. It cannot be described otherwise because rich countries always have interests abroad that they have to protect. Capitalism is a world's economy, so a rich country, of course, is interested in other countries' richness and the need to protect those interests if it goes in tandem to privilege your own and link one country with colonialistic practices, it happens naturally. Therefore, we have a prerogative being nationality, a legacy that creates a description of race. If you are outside this race, you would be inferior and you are the one to blame giving your inferiority. Let's say Puerto Rico. What happened after Hurricane Maria? There was a blackout that it's still ongoing, and it's the largest blackout in the U.S. history. The grid in the island was destroyed. What was the solution vis-a-vis tremendous disaster? To give a contract to a company that only had 2 workers when the hurricane hit the island. And how did they know of the heads of Puerto Rico electric companies that this actual company existed? Well, it was not due to the closeness between business people and the Puerto Ricans. The Whitefish Energy Company that received the contract is not the Puerto Rican equivalent of IGA Group as we have in Mexico. We don't have cronies working together because this is a company that was once based in Montana. So what did the Puerto Rican politicians saw in this company to grant this responsibility for such a large contract? Well, the answer apparently is very simple. Whitefish Enemy Company is from where the Interior Secretary of the U.S. in Washington was born, Ryan Zinke, and the establishment in Puerto Rico knows it very well. America First begins at home, specifically at the White House. So there is a colonialistic abuse, like the East India Company in Bengali in the last century. So the Puerto Rican government is paying Whitefish $319 per hour for every electrician compared to the $19 that a Puerto Rican electrician would earn. So the Whitefish scandal at the end was enough to terminate the contract, and the head of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Company had to resign. But the domination regime is very clear, even in this dark episode. Today, 2 months after this disaster, Puerto Rico is still in a blackout, and the support received by Puerto Ricans from the federal government has not been commensurate to what the quote-unquote true Americans receive during hardship. Therefore, the islanders have only received one fraction of food stamps that the residents of Texas and Florida would get after the hurricanes, but Puerto Ricans need to keep quiet. They should not complain, as Donald Trump said during his visit to the island, but the number of people dying was very small compared to a true disaster as the hurricane hitting Houston. And Trump made an appearance in the island, scolded San Juan's mayor for complaining, and he said that he would not support the island forever, and the number of deaths was miraculously low, and he left. Probably the number of the death toll was, yes, not that big as Houston's, but Eric Klinenberg, a sociologist specializing in death tolls in natural disasters that are masked and are usually poor and members of racial minorities, not many days ago published that there were 472 more people dying in 2017 than in last September. So that means that there might be considerably a larger death toll in this disaster in Puerto Rico than in the true catastrophe in Houston, where only 82 people died. In other words, what we have seen during the hurricane in Puerto Rico is a domination, an expoliation attitude, and a lack of interest in investing in Puerto Rico, as Puerto Rico was an equal of the U.S. And this happens in an island in which 3.4 million inhabitants are U.S. citizens. The result for Puerto Ricans is very sensitive. They know that they are second-class citizens. So what can we expect from this U.S. ethnic policy for Mexicans if Mexicans are not U.S. citizens? Will we see responsibility in this war that has left more people dead than Iraq? Will we see some shared responsibility in terms of immigration? Because this comes from the free trade agreement. Of course, we won't see any responsibility. This America First policy pretends that every problem in Mexico has been created by Mexicans, and it is due to the proliferation of bad hombres and things of that sort, and the racial inferiority of Mexicans as well. Ethnic nationalism in a rich country is like an old school imperialistic practice. And it also, in any rich or poor country, this is what causes racism, as Pepe Waldenberg said in those cases that we see in Poland and Hungary, where you have countries which are not that rich, but the nationalism movement is using racism to consolidate itself. I'm sharing this in the most rigorous sense. Rationalization is an operation that sets differences between races. Americans, in this sense, would be great because that's how they are, and Puerto Ricans are second-class citizens because that's how Puerto Ricans are. And that rejection in an American policy sees the consolidation of a certain order and universal international rules. It's another use of old school racism. This type of nationalism creates reactive nationalisms vis-a-vis exclusion and racism. The excluded create their own nationalism. That is how we see in black nationalistic movement in the U.S. in the 60s after Martin Luther King was killed. And it was how we have Zionism in Eastern Europe by the end of the 19th century. And this is how in the pre-revolutionary Mexico we have the claim of Mexico for the Mexicans. But those reactionary nationalisms entail risks. That's why the question that Mexico has to pose in terms of building the wall, how should we react? We should not always strictly be reactionary. And the lack of recognition and the lack of shared responsibility from the United States towards Mexico would have to be the starting point of a new nationalistic policy. The U.S. has turned its back to international agreements and, in general, to diplomacy. Its attitude, well, there are many countries that don't have a U.S. ambassador to their countries after a year of Trump's victory, so the U.S. diplomacy in general has been attacked. Not only international agreements. Now, the attitude towards the Paris agreements is a very pragmatic example. Mexico, in turn, will have to invest a great deal in participating in international agreements and being diplomatic in terms of Europe, Canada, Asia, and Africa. We need to strengthen Mexican diplomacy, and Mexico should be a favorable force that is for internationalism. In the area of drugs, Mexico has to put an end to its collaboration with the U.S. and take the role of world leader. It should claim that role. Mexico has put the people who have died in this war waged against drugs. Weapon smuggling into Mexico has killed more people here than illegal drugs being smuggled into the United States. Mexico should fight unilaterally and also an international arena to regulate drugs through public health institutions. There is no reason why Mexico should collaborate in the United States, and there's no reason to work as a supporter and representative in handling Central American immigration. There should not be partnerships where there is no real practical and mutual identification of shared responsibilities. The difficulties that Mexico will face is that by having more autonomy, which entails all of these changes, is not an easy task. And there are many bad examples in the past that we should avoid. For example, Porfirio Diaz tried to mitigate the U.S. influence by giving concessions to other powers, England, France, Germany, and Japan. And that temptation to counteract the U.S. power, giving concessions to China and Japan and Europe, it's paramount. And of course, some concessions will have to take place, but the logic to create autonomy by granting concessions to rival powers would take us back to the issue of Porfirian years. The best and the greatest portion of the Mexican economy was given to the hands of foreign investors, and Mexicans ended up being second-class citizens in their own land. Therefore, looking for more autonomy would need to be hand in hand in people-to-people investment by having an agreement on the quality of education, consolidating minimal standards for food and a minimum standard for political equality and economic equality. Without that, the search for our autonomy would walk the wrong path that we've seen during Porfirian times. Probably Trump's nationalism being so radical is an opportunity to see how our country has not made a strong commitment in growing stronger domestically, because immigration during the democratic transition offered a way out, a costly but a way out. If we go back to Albert Hirschman about ours and a way out, we can develop a stronger criticism in the last few decades that has tended to create partnerships with the lower schooling countries and with the lower countries, because most of the population could always live to work in the United States and support their countries with such level of remittances. It is true that we've been conformist in terms of schooling, not only in the political spectrum that they don't want to invest in public goods, but also from the left wing. They have not taken seriously the importance of being productive and increasing levels of schooling. And this takes us to another topic, the quality of our democracy and what we could call a crisis of responsibility. We are surrounded by a bizarre mix of inequality and inefficiency. There is bureaucracy that wants to document transparency, but what we can't find is responsibility, and that denigrates democracy by reducing it to simulations of what works. Now, ethno-nationalism that we see in the U.S. is leaving us alone. We cannot afford seeing simulations in governance. Our democracy requires to give priority to efficiency and responsibility. Thank you very much.
Yes, we now have, let me put it this way, if you agree with that, we have 45 minutes, if that's okay to start. We started 10 or 15 minutes late, so from here till 2. Oh, if there's no inconvenience, we would stay till about 2:15 to make up for those minutes we lost at the beginning. So, in principle, I have 4 questions that came here as your interventions here today. I've just received more questions that I shall organize in this round of questions. But let me start out with the first question that, to a certain degree, allows me to put different arguments together. Well, it's evident that we are not here, none of us, concerned about the small history. Most of the arguments we heard this afternoon, this noon, we're talking about macrohistoric processes. How is it that digital technologies are entering into our civilization? How it is that elements related to human beings have been addressed or resolved or haven't been? And Harari, a very young historian, echoing a little of what Hector Aguilar was saying a few minutes ago. He says that the main scourge of civilization, it's their hunger, violence, and disease. And certainly, if you look at indicators, not only in terms of violence, but also hunger or disease, we are going to find that humankind has taken enormous civilizatory steps forward. And just last year, 1 million people died because of famine or hunger, and 3 million people because of being overweight. What a paradox, right? Terrible paradox. Yes. Those of us that are here today, 5 of us here up this stage, and all of you in the auditorium, we are the object of the pressure of two major groups. Those, on one hand, who are singing self-complacency of our times, and the others that are in the self-flagellating themselves, that are, if we have to look in this macro historic process, we have to look exactly where we are going to place ourselves, because Hector Aguilar is right when he says that we've modified these indicators in a very important manner. This siege against civilization, we've done it from Voltaire till our times. That is, since modernity placed science, and this means reason, that which is reasonable, as a method to approximate us to truth. And what we are seeing as the main harassment or siege is that this method for us to be closer to truth is now being questioned. I'll ask the question, but just the 2016 electoral campaign in the U.S. This is a cartoon, a caricature of what was happening. We had one guy saying, yes, this is a 9. The other guy in front of him was saying, no, this is a 6. No image explains this campaign better in the United States, because what this campaign meant to say is that we can believe in different things and nothing will ever happen. However, things do happen. Beethoven, how would he react if his the 6th and the 9th would be the same thing? Or my neighbor who lives in the 9th floor and I live in the 6th floor, can I keep his house? Well, what's at risk is the method of approximation to universal values that Waldenberg was referring to. Truth as a construct after an act of deliberation, and what Waldenberg was also saying, yes, reason, if it stops being the mechanism through which we reach agreements, then reason applied to politics, democracy that is also at risk. Let me go back to a question that I was asking at the beginning, and this is, how profound is this a threat on the method we had used in this last 300 years to approximate ourselves to common truths? For this first question, you can make use of the floor and let us be very expedite so that we can have many questions answered. Yes. Jose Waldenberg, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I do have a comment on what Hector said. I'm not even sure if I'm answering your question. However, I think it's true. Seen in civil story terms, everything that Hector has said on the table, well, it is true. However, the concern that I think we should try to clear here is why, in spite of everything, of all those things that were mentioned, there's this installed malaise, or discomfort, which is generating political reactions, xenophobic reactions, racist reactions that are closed in and against the Enlightenment and against all types of science and against the Paris Accords, like negating climate change. And I think that to answer this, the very long terms is of no use to us, really. Let me try to explain myself. It is very difficult for the Mexican community to compare rates of violence in Mexico with what happened in the pre-Hispanic world. But we can compare it, and with reason, with what happened 15 or 20 years ago in Mexico. As rightly said by Hector, the homicide rates had been declining consistently. And as of 2008, we've seen this triggering and this increase of this type of homicides. So it's very difficult to ask the Mexican community, for instance, to react taking into account the very long term or I think communities react in great measure in junctures or vis-a-vis junctures. So we've not only had an increase of murders or homicides, and every day we see in the 30,000 people who've disappeared, those forced disappearances. And all those things, that's what I believe is having an impact on the public mood today, and what is making that the little or the much we've been able to build in terms of common life, democratic life, and the emergence of pluralism, coexistence, and institutional competition is wearing out. And something similar we could say in other issues, for instance, at the economic level. The Mexico of today compared with the Mexico at the beginning of the 20th century or with pre-Hispanic communities, well, surely there's material progress that's been made. But in recent years, what we have seen is that economic growth in our country does not allow us to incorporate people, millions of people into informal jobs. Formal jobs, I mean, and this is not what happened in the 19th century, but what happened even in Mexico itself from the decades between from 1932 to 1982 without any statistical rigor. What happened is that the economy was growing in Mexico, and by growing this economy, well, people had more opportunities, and the living conditions, the material living conditions of many people improved. I would even dare say this was one of the fuels, the lubricants for the Mexican situation, because families were increasingly better in general terms. So what has happened in recent years? This trend is completely the opposite. Many families are doing worse off, and through the expectations that children are going to be worse off than the parents. Well, this is an injection of malaise, discomfort, and that can be explained, of course, and this is, of course, eating up or undermining a lot of everything we've been able to build in Mexico. So I believe that we do have to pay attention to these realities if we do not want there's the Latin Barometer report. The appreciation of actors and institutions that make democracy possible will continue wearing out, not only in Mexico, but in Latin America and many parts of Europe as well. And in the U.S., there, I believe, well, we have the problems such as Hector pointed out. In the most important country, the richest country of the world, all of a sudden they have a president like the one they have, and I'm sorry to use this term, this is a self-parody, this is an emissary of the past. And this is what I wanted to point out, and I didn't want to just let it pass. Yes, I couldn't agree more with Waldenberg.
And that's probably the gap in my own view about Mexico. Well, the civilization, yes, is under siege, not necessarily discussing only Mexico's issues. If we analyze figures, what we have seen in Mexico is a process that is uncivilizatory. It's severe what is going on in Mexico. It is as big as the figures are, and it doesn't have a glimpse of reaching a solution. And we do not only need the specialists to talk about this, we need authorities, we need institutions, we need serious institutions that govern this country and that have to consider their own issues seriously before trying to solve anything. And by this, I mean the political powers in this country, governments, autonomous institutions, the mass media, universities, and the debate of this kind of violence that it's destroying the Mexican youth. I just published a column on what the University of Guadalajara studied on how this level of violence is centered in male population between 15 to 34 years in Mexico. That means that in the last decade, the Mexican male population between 15 and 75 years decreased 1%. I'm sorry, I'll correct myself. Life expectancy reduce 1%. If this is not an attempt to any civilization, what is it? I completely agree. And the concern that we have, okay, but let me go back to what I'm trying to say. What we see ahead, our civilization, well, we are within a bubble. And the long-term trends upon which we're standing upon, this means that it's going to be a bubble unless we have a nuclear catastrophe. If this is not a bubble, well, this can go to hell. And I'm really concerned because Kim Il-jung's head, or whatever his name is, in North Korea, when he reaches to the conclusion that he's going to get killed, whatever he does, he's going to get killed, just as Hussein was killed, just as Gaddafi and Mubarak. If he reaches to that conclusion that he's going to be killed and that his country will disappear, frankly, I don't see what is the incentive that he has not to throw the bomb, because he has a bomb and he can throw the bomb. So that's what I meant. So the problems in Mexico are more specific, and we also need very intelligent responses that need to be based on a very good diagnostic. Now, discontent and the affection for anti-politics that we see in the public sphere is a very severe problem. It's a severe problem for democracy, for governance, and for the possibility of seeing Mexico thrive. This can be a bubble. This could be a moment where democratic institutions are stagnated. And the same dilemma posed by Claudia. How is that Mexico can design a new policy vis-a-vis this new type of U.S. government whose main direction is racist? I'm very concerned also in this democratic deconstruction and in the anti-politics. We see social networks. Social networks in Mexico fulfill many of the features that our friend has described. I mean, yes, there's discontent, but there's discontent without a cause. So they make this conversation more plural, yes, but they don't make it more democratic. And we have hate speech on the one hand, and we have a trivialization process of every conversation that is put up there. But we see that there's a lot of feeling in there. There is feeling in there, and there's true emotions there, and it makes it more difficult to have a conversation. And this polarizes, this divides, and I don't know if it also forgets, but also builds and deconstructs trust in democratic institutions, and also the clarity of this public conversation. Yes, Cici.
You know, you asked if these changes are profound enough. I would say that, yes, of course they are. But I would also like to talk more about the issue of nationalism, because I feel that seems to be the common thread between all of us and in our conversation, as well as the growth of populism. And we focused a lot on what has happened in the United States with the latest elections and with Trump. But I think there's cause to be concerned for growing nationalism, for the different gradations or variations of nationalism, not just in the US, but around the world. We have the most recent results of the German elections and the difficulty that Angela Merkel is facing in forming a unified government. We have, of course, the latest Austrian elections. Thank God the French had a second round of election. Of course, we have the Brexit results, which, as you were pointing out, show that there's very intense sentiment behind the way people think. But there isn't empathy, the empathy that many of you mentioned. There isn't cognitive reasoning, there isn't emotional reaction, because I think that if there was cognitive processing, people would find it very difficult to justify the logic behind the thinking of extremist groups as well as the extremist thinking of President Trump. Also, if there was an emotional reaction, people would find it very difficult to not empathize with these issues. But it's important to historicize the problem and understand that historically, whenever we encounter a growth of nationalism and populism, it's always accompanied or preceded by economic insecurity. There's a wealth disparity, and there's also a sense of insecurity that makes people vulnerable, easily persuaded, but the sort of empty arguments that nationalism presents. And an important question to ask, I think, is not just who is Trump and what is he saying, because Trump, is a convenient open signifier, and open signifiers are open so that people can align with them and fill them with all kinds of meaning. And every person has their own meaning that they project and their own reason why they effectively attune to that particular signifier, President Trump. The question that I think media should focus on, and my background is in social psychology, I study the media. The important question is, who is behind these leaders? Who is behind President Trump? He is not a phenomenon, nor are these other leaders who emerged overnight. It was a phenomenon that was brewing over some time, and it was a phenomenon that was very financially supported very well by a specific and complex ideological apparatus. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me add a second question here. Jose Waldenberg was saying in his comments that part of this disaffection for democracy and democratic institutions is due to the lack of capacity or incapacity of institutions to incorporate the younger generations. I mean, young people as a problem. On the other hand, something which is floating in Cesar's presentation with Hector's last comment is that these instruments of communication, social networks, could be an element that's altering the old institutions that we don't know whether it is taking them to. Nonetheless, let me present counterfactual evidence, if you allow me. If you look at the electoral map in the United States 2016, and you ask yourselves, looking at this map, who would people between 18 and 25, who would have voted? Would have won in 49 of the 52 entities. Young people would have voted for Hillary Clinton. And if we move towards Brexit, we are going to find exactly the same. That is, we are the problem, not youth. Well, maybe I'm moving forward or ahead of myself with the hypothesis. We do not know how to use the social networks, but they know how to use them. So they're really understanding who to vote for here. So I ask this relating everything that Zizi and Jose have mentioned, which would be your reaction? These maps that are public, and that is very important for us to comment on them. Yes.
I was very happy to hear you say that. My tendency is always to say that young people are the solution, not the problem. But I think it's a little bit more complex than that. I think in order for young people to be the solution, I think we have to present them with alternatives that are appealing. I think we have to present them with candidates that they can connect with. And I think we have to not only understand their language, but speak it as well. In my work, and I spend a lot of my time studying the behavior of young people. And the behavior of young people is often misunderstood. They're often described as disaffected and cynical and skeptic and not very involved and maybe a little bit hurried when they think about what sort of political stance they're going to take. And perhaps, that stance is not historically informed or doesn't have historical context. But it has its own context, which we have to understand. And it also stems from the concern that they're going to have to live in the world that we created. We're going to die at some point. So we're going to take those problems with us to the grave. But I think it's very important that we leave behind us a world that can inspire the young.
Creo que
I think that poor young people, they always have to carry on their shoulders the thing that they're the hope of the future, whatever that is. And I don't think we should be making them responsible for such a big burden here. I mean, this is not a favor. This is a disfavor, perhaps. Well, what I do think, on the other hand, is that one of the things of the discussion that I'm realizing right now between Waldenberg and Hector is that we haven't just started talking about general phenomena, which is not only for Mexico, change of the working of the labor structure, and we're not creating jobs for youth throughout the world, generally speaking. And so young people have to start organizing themselves, generating forms of social organization, novel forms to functionalize these forms that existed perhaps that were not being used in the same fashion, and in order to live and survive. Because what is happening at the labor level in the youth, what does this have to do with the image of development that we used to have, the time of industries and the time of development as manufacturing processes? So this is changing. This is in decadence right now. And from what I understand, which is not much that I understand, this is going to be moving really very, very fast from now on. So we are in the very, very soon, we are going to see how youth, not only youth, I mean, but certainly young people, they're going to have to get organized differently. And the socialization of the reproduction costs of society will have to find new channels, because if they're going to be just simply unemployed without network, and the factories start closing down, not closing down, but not the automotive factories, but they start kicking people out or firing people. A very large part of their workers are going to be laid off. And all the manufacturing industry here in Mexico is so important, as we know, and we're going to have declining jobs there as well. This is going to be reduced. So the youth issue would require, I believe, forms of new forms of participation that they're already inventing. Perhaps they've already invented those forms. The last thing I wanted to add as part of this issue is that almost always young people, this figure of youth that we have in Latin America, for instance, in the hope, the future of America and all those things, well, this is just a cliche since the 1900s at least. But this usually has to do is something that takes place around movements, like here in Mexico, the last earthquake. So you have this thing that's being created, and this is created around an event. And when there's no event, there's no generation identity. This is what I mean, 1968, for instance, and here in Mexico and other parts of the world, yes.
Sorry for insisting, but why is it that this young people said no to Trump? And why did they reject the Brexit? I mean, it is not Hunger Games if we are giving the youth that hope responsibility. So they said no to that game, but their elders said yes.
I was asking for the floor before. I'm not answering your question right now. I'm answering something else. I just want to make it safe for me. I'm just trying to protect myself, so to say. Well, I don't want to coin the phrase that I told young people as a problem. I'm not saying they're a problem. I don't want this to be coined as my phrase. I mean, so what is the problem youth is facing? I mean, what are young people facing? That's what I meant when I said precisely that many of them are not finding a placement or place in the labor market. And in our case, well, this issue becomes even worse because they're not even finding a place in the higher education centers throughout the world or here in Mexico. The former president of the university, Mr. Narro, spoke about the ninis. They're not working, they're not studying. The ninis, they're not doing one thing, they're not doing another thing either. So what Claudio is now saying, we have this, continue highlighting this in the next years, this precarious growth. And that's the reason. And the new production formula, that those formulas do not require the incorporation of so many people in the labor market. So what you were saying, this is a sign of encouragement. And I think you're right. I mean, it's quite likely that a lot of this backwards movement, nationalism is more in adults than young people. I hope that's the case. But I cannot say anything more on this. At any rate, talking about youth is always an abuse. Why? Because it is an enormous, contradictory, differentiated universe crossed by enormous inequalities and inequities. And let's say, well, this is a very encouraging sign, everything you're informing us about. Let me clarify that MAGA, Make America Great Again, is rather a movement of people who are over 40 years of age. And perhaps that's what's the problem is being, and I would like to accept this generalization. It has to do with this phenomenon. Brexit is a case in point as well. Well, the question would be, those young people who would have voted for Clinton didn't vote, did they? Well, there's the counting process could only be done on those who voted. And if only those that voted would have won, well, maybe they didn't vote in the numbers you're talking about, but, well, the numbers that would have been necessary for her to win, right? If all those that would have voted that didn't vote for her, well, perhaps she would have won. But at any rate, there's an important topic here for young people of Mexico, because in the midst of this anti-politics, the message for young people and everyone else is that we do not deserve the politicians we have and we shouldn't vote for them. And you can have, for instance, a cohort of voters that do not go vote because they don't think any politicians deserves their vote. And so what happens is the obvious thing. They're not interested in politics. They're not interested in deciding. Well, others will decide for them. If the young people of Mexico want to decide in this next election, 2018, they're the bigger cohort of voters that we have. It's enormous. Pepe knows about this, but the cohort that we have of voters between 18 and 35 years of age could be perhaps two-thirds, or rather 50%, half of the total voters. So the youth will decide who's going to be ruling Mexico. I believe, Claudio, that Klaus mentioned a very serious issue related to giving a horizon to young people because they're the ones that are going to school. And this topic has to do with the educational situation. This has to be an absolutely central topic. And there's another one which is even more immediate, that is youth who do not study, not in employment, education, or training, and they're out in the streets committing crime. And let me now go on to details, not generalities. And what is it that we would massively have to do for that to be interrupted? I know a case of the state of Tamaulipas in the northern part of Mexico, one of the most violent in Mexico, and the San Fernando community, also in Tamaulipas, where what they did was to enable as a meeting center, a meeting point, and teaching center for dancing, traditional dancing, and just coexistence and cohabitation. Those classrooms that were empty in the afternoon because they only had classes in the morning, so they got them ready as coexistence, cohabitation centers in the afternoon. And this little town where youth didn't have a place to meet, then they all of a sudden started having meeting places for youth that so that they would be out on the streets and the bar or the disco or the just out in the streets, out in the open. And what happened was that in just a very short period of time, this was a very good effect from the viewpoint that the community of this very small city, I don't think it's over 5,000 inhabitants, it starts having a space where young people are not finding a job, they're not finding anything to do. They are finding other young people, and they are finding the part of society they should be meeting with. And I think this is, to start with, a very good principle. If we can imagine, of all the little towns in Mexico, to reestablish that which is called once, and we call it once more and forever, with the social fabric of that strip of the youth segment of Mexico.
To say something real
Sí,
quick, or
adelante.
no? I just when you mentioned that young people voted for Hillary and against Brexit, I thought good. I was pleasantly surprised because I, I like Hillary Clinton as a candidate, but I'm not 20, and I also find things appealing about the policies that Bernie Sanders proposed, but I'm not, what would count as a young person. I think with the elections, we had a lot of people who voted for those candidates in the United States, but also a lot of young people who abstained and a lot of African Americans who abstained because they didn't find that the candidates spoke their language. There was one candidate in the recent U.S. history presidential elections that young people aligned behind very enthusiastically, and that was former President Obama, of course. And I remember when he was first elected in 2008, it was when I had first moved in Chicago, and in Chicago was where he accepted, where he learned that he had won the election. There was a huge event that was organized in the park. I was in the media tent, but there were also huge screens everywhere. The park was filled with millions, I don't exaggerate, mostly young people. And when it was announced that he had won, people were exuberant. They were cheering. And I mean, people, in the age of cell phones and this and that and the other, people were just very delighted and exhilarated to be outside. They were singing, they were dancing in the street. I hadn't seen something like that in my lifetime, but it did remind me of what it might have been like in '68 or in other revolutionary moments. And here comes the kicker. I was telling this story to a friend who lived in South Carolina at the time. And I said, in 2008, when Obama was elected, there were people dancing and singing on the streets. But in 2016, when we heard that Trump was elected in Chicago, there was utter silence, and everybody went to bed early. And he said to me, "It's really great, Cece, but I lived in South Carolina when Obama was elected. And this silence that you described, that's what we heard then." So I'm very happy that young people voted for Hillary. And also, were behind Bernie Sanders. I would like for there to be more young people in politics as well, who speak a new language, who have new ideas. But I was also very disappointed because the neo-fascists, the neo-Nazis that marched in Charlottesville with those tiki torches, those people were very, very young too.
Voy a lanzar una última pregunta, casi a manera de conclusión. Nos quedan 5 minutos para cerrar.
We have to wrap up. We have 5 minutes, but I'll throw this last question. These are concerns that have these two nations, the U.S. and Mexico, very concerned about where the border is. There's no way to know what is the future of that border. We don't know. It might be a border that would enrich itself culturally. Probably it can be a border that even polarized can get solutions, like Lorraine was a very conflictive border until it ended up being conflictive, and that was how Europe became a different place. But the border between Pakistan and India is one of the most conflictive and violent ones. Between Lorraine and Alsace and Pakistan and India and Mexico and the U.S., what would be the future of this wall? Let's make some predictions. Let's forecast here. And yeah, let's try to be optimistic as well, just to close. Claudio, please, by acclamation, and then I'll give you the floor. I think that the urban centers next to the U.S.-Mexico border grew as one single city. Sometimes these are cities that exist because there's a border. All the borders, cities to the west of Ciudad Juarez, for example. Now, the level of integration is very high, and I don't think it's going to be easy to untangle the situation. I believe that these are situations where you have a very strong awareness of integration, even when there are very reactive attitudes on both sides. I believe that this is an area that makes it very difficult, whatever wall they build. And last time I was in Tijuana, it was two years ago, and I landed in San Diego because I was flying from New York, and I visited the Baja California University, and the driver told me about the traffic routes, and it's very interesting for any Mexico City dweller to know about that. And they have their own traffic if you go from Tijuana to San Diego, because there is a lot of people from the U.S. rather lease a house in Tijuana because it's so expensive to pay for a house in San Diego. So you have that type of integration that it's very difficult to untangle. So I don't think that actually the Lorraine model is as parallel, because these are not provinces that would integrate Alsace and Lorraine and Prussia, integrated those, and then these lands were taken over by a different country and there was an international litigation. But this border as it is, and well, if Trump wants to take Baja California over, well, I don't think that we can make comparisons between the U.S. and Mexico border and Europe. And the India-Pakistan model, I don't think so, even when there are parallels. There have been some cases of deportation, as we've heard from India, Pakistan, from when we saw Mexicans being deported after the Great Depression in the 30s, and now massive deportations are happening now. So when deportation peaks, yes, that can create a more tricky situation in the border if the deportees have to find some base and station there for a while and then try to go back. And in that sense, we would see some parallels between India and Pakistan, but I think this is a different border. This is a border with such a level of integration and traffic. I mean, the flow of people is so big that we would have to see a big change, not only striking NAFTA down, but that's my impression.
Oh, when we're asked to make predictions are always very difficult, because you make a prediction and then it always comes back to haunt you. But I will say this, I think that there is a small likelihood that the wall will be built for a number of reasons. First, because it's an absurd idea, And second, because it is very difficult to execute for a number of reasons, which you spoke about very eloquently. In addition, what's important to understand about the wall is that it's used symbolically and rhetorically for President Trump to make a particular point and to also create a lot of intensity that is very convenient for him. It allows him to create cohesion among his supporters. And also permits him to distract from other problems. But at any rate, I do not believe that there is likelihood that this wall will be built because A, it would not solve any problems, and it would be more convenient for Trump to not build the wall, because then he would have the benefit of saying, look, see, I wanted to build this great, wonderful wall that would solve all of our problems, but you stopped me, and now here we are. So that is my thinking and my reaction on that topic.
Héctor.
Bueno, ya habrán notado que padezco esta.
I know that you've realized that I suffer from long-term optimism and short-term pessimism. That's my disease, as Gramsci said. You need to have pessimistic of intelligence and pessimism of will. I believe that what will happen with this border, as it's been said by Claudio Lomnitz, it is not only about that physical place, but it's basically that internal, institutional, and cultural wall in our daily lives where it is impossible not to be Mexican or not to be a migrant. It doesn't matter if you're a legal or illegal migrant, but that's what we face every day. In my opinion, what will happen with this is that it's going to keep on happening the same thing as we have seen. It's impressive the level of integration in every single level. NAFTA somehow ordered things economically after an unbelievable level of integration that represents the existence of a Mexican and a Mexican-American community of 45 million in the U.S. and 11 undocumented migrants. That is a reality that is not going to change. In that sense, I believe what is going on with Trump, it's what happens with Trump, with civilizations in general. Trump is a bubble. Trump represents a bubble in terms of integration between the U.S. and Mexico. It can be expensive, it can be violent, it can arouse very old feelings that Mexicans have against the U.S. But it is a bubble. It is impossible to make it go back. An extraordinary historian, a friend of ours, Mauricio Tenorio, wrote an essay which is very deep and thorough, and he said, hey, gringos, you have to understand that you have a Mexican inside you. The interpretation booth apologizes. That microphone is not working. We can hear Mr. Camin. Not with the National Guard, with the deportations. So that is part of the biological life of these two nations. And in that sense, I believe that being very pessimistic about what is going to happen in the short term and how are things being experienced by Mexicans in the U.S. in the long term, the trend that they have set, that historical trend, that demographic trend, that cultural trend is invincible. And it is going to give rise to more serious integration, of course, with conflicts, but this is an evident reality. We don't understand very well that Mexicans who left, they don't want to come back. They chose a country that is not Mexico. It's not because they forgot about Mexico. It's not that they don't feel themselves Mexicans, because Mexico has not served their purpose in terms of a country. They need to have a good job, to have a good education, to be given opportunities that they're looking for, and that's why they live. Mexico have been part of many meetings with migrants, and not a single one of them living on that side. I've never heard them say that they want to come back to Mexico. They come by force. They want to stay there and they want to continue with their life there. Every time they're told, welcome back, what they want is something different. What they want is to be protected, to have solidarity from the Mexican government, but over there. They don't want to be deported. They want to continue with their lives there.
José Walmer.
Thank you, Hector. Jose Wallenberg, any comments? I coincide with everything they've said. I coincide. Yes, long term, we're all dying. Long term, we're all dying. We're all going to be dead long term anyway. Yeah, personal long term, we're all going to be dead. That's for sure. Well, anyway, what about Mexicans? Mexicans in here, there, who's dying, who's not dying? Well, anything on this, Pepe? You said 2:15. It's already 2:25. So listen, thank you so much for your presence. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Jose, Hector, and Claudio, and of course, Zizi. Thank you so much, and thank you those of you in the networks and internet watching us. And we shall continue this event looking at Switch Against Civilization, and that allows us to see from wall to wall which is the future that awaits our civilization. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.
¿Cuándo te vas?